They laughed at his house. They called it ugly, a prison, and an eyesore. But when the temperature hit -28 degrees, the beautiful log cabin next door started to crush itself from the inside out. While one neighbor was trapped in a freezing home that was slowly imploding, the other was safe inside a vertical fortress. Here is the true story of why physics always beats tradition. September 12, 1895, the Quinault Peninsula, Upper Michigan. The locals called this place the Copper Country, but by mid-September, the copper in the ground was the only thing warmer than the air. The gales off Lake Superior were already stripping the birch trees bare, signaling a winter that would be etched in the tombstones of the local cemeteries. Olaf Jensen stood in a clearing of cedar and tamarack, holding a heavy plow plane. He wasn't a farmer, and he wasn't a trapper. He was a retired timberman from the Calumet and Hecla mines. He spent 30 years deep underground, ensuring that millions of tons of rock didn't collapse on men's heads. He understood load, he understood pressure, and most importantly, he understood the behavior of wood under stress. But to Thomas Miller, whose homestead bordered Jensen's to the south, Olaf looked like a man who had forgotten how a house works. Miller sat atop his buckboard wagon, reining in his horses as he watched Jensen work. Jensen wasn't notching corners. He wasn't stacking logs horizontally like Lincoln logs, the way every cabin in American history had been built since the Swedes landed in Delaware. Jensen was standing the logs up, vertical, straight up and down, like the bars of a prison cell. "You building a horse stable, Jensen?" Miller shouted, the wind whipping his coat. "Or are you expecting the sheriff to come lock you up?" Jensen didn't look up. He ran the plow plane down the side of a massive 10-inch cedar log, carving a deep 1-inch groove along its entire vertical length. "Building a home, Thomas, same as you," Miller laughed, a harsh sound that cracked through the cold air. He pointed a gloved finger at the structure. It looked jarring. It lacked the romantic, crossed-corner aesthetic of the frontier. It looked like a stockade. It looked industrial. It looked ugly. "It's an eyesore, Olaf," Miller spat. "That thing won't hold heat. You got no chinking. You got no weight pressing down to seal the gaps. First time the Superior gale hits that wall, those upright sticks are gonna rattle like loose teeth. You're building a vertical coffin." Jensen finally set the plane down. He picked up a long, thin slat of dried white oak spline and slid it perfectly into the groove he had just cut. He pushed the next vertical log against it, locking the two timbers together with the floating strip of oak hidden inside. "Wood moves, Thomas," Jensen said, his voice like grinding gravel. "You built your cabin out of green pine 3 weeks ago. You stacked it 10 feet high. You think it's gonna stay 10 feet high? It'll settle." Miller shrugged. "That's what cabins do. Put a little more mud in the cracks next year. It won't just settle," Jensen warned, picking up his mallet. "It's gonna crush you." Miller shook his head, clicked his tongue at the horses, and rode off. He left Jensen to his ugly vertical fort. Miller returned to his own cabin, a handsome, traditional structure with perfectly notched horizontal logs, thick layers of moss and clay chinking, and a proud pitched roof. It was the picture of the American dream. Jensen returned to his work. He knew the physics that Miller was ignoring. He knew that the aesthetic beauty of a horizontal log cabin concealed a structural time bomb. For the next month, Jensen labored with obsessive precision. He created a stockade-style home, technically known as Post-on-Sill. He anchored a heavy sill plate into the bedrock. Then, he slotted every single vertical log onto that sill. The secret wasn't just the orientation, it was the floating spline. And Jensen knew that as his green logs dried, they would shrink. But he also knew the one rule of dendrology, the study of wood that pioneers often learned the hard way. Wood shrinks across the grain, but it remains stable along the grain. He slipped the dry oak splines into the vertical grooves. He didn't nail them, he didn't glue them, he let them float. When the logs eventually shrank in width, the gap would widen, but the spline would still bridge the two logs, blocking the wind. The wall would remain airtight, even as the wood changed shape. By November, the snow was 4 feet deep. The ugly cabin stood stark and gray against the white landscape, its vertical lines mimicking the surrounding forest. If you want to understand the survival engineering that actually conquered the frontier, hit that subscribe button. We don't just tell stories, we explain how they survived them. The winter of 1896 didn't arrive. It attacked. By January 15th, the temperature dropped to minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there for 3 weeks. The moisture in the air turned to ice fog. But the cold wasn't the enemy that destroyed Thomas Miller. The enemy was the heat inside his own house. Inside Miller's traditional cabin, a tragedy of physics was unfolding. He was blasting his cast-iron stove to keep his family warm. The intense heat was rapidly drying out the green pine logs of his interior walls. As the moisture left the wood, the cells collapsed. The logs began to shrink in diameter. A 10-inch log can lose up to 3/4 of an inch in diameter as it dries from green to seasoned. Miller's wall was 12 logs high. Do the math. 12 logs each losing nearly an inch. By late January, Miller's cabin walls had slumped. The entire roof structure, weighing tons, rode down with the shrinking walls. The total height of his house dropped by a massive 7 inches in 6 weeks. The first sign of disaster was the window. The glass pane was set in a rigid wooden frame. The frame was nailed to the logs. As the logs shrank and the wall height decreased, the space for the window became smaller than the window itself. At 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, a loud pop echoed through Miller's cabin. The pressure of the descending logs had crushed the window frame. The glass shattered outward, exploding into the snow. Miller scrambled out of bed, cursing, stuffing a quilt into the broken window to stop the sub-zero draft. He didn't understand. He thought the house was shifting in the wind. He didn't realize his house was slowly imploding. 3 days later, the real danger revealed itself. Miller's wife Sarah tried to open the front door to fetch snow for melting. The latch clicked, but the door wouldn't budge. She pushed, she hammered on it. "Thomas," she screamed, "the door is stuck." The door frame was a vertical rigid structure set into a horizontal shrinking wall. As the log walls settled those 7 fatal inches, they pressed down on the header of the door frame with thousands of pounds of force. The frame had bowed inward, clamping the door in a vice grip. They were trapped. Panic set in. The stove was smoking because the chimney pipe, which was fixed through the roof, was being pushed up as the roof sank. Dislodging the connection, smoke filled the room. The window was blown out. The door was jammed shut. The settling that Miller had dismissed as normal was now threatening to kill them. Miller grabbed a felling axe. He had to hack his way out of his own home. He spent an hour destroying his front door, splintering the expensive oak just to create an exit. When he finally stumbled out into the blinding white light of the afternoon, he looked across the valley. Smoke was rising lazily, perfectly vertical, from Olaf Jensen's chimney. Miller wrapped his scarf around his face and trudged through the drifts. He expected to find Jensen in similar misery. He expected to see the vertical logs rattled loose, the ugly cabin filled with snow. He reached Jensen's porch. The vertical logs looked exactly as they had in September. He knocked on the heavy plank door. It swung open silently, effortlessly on its hinges. The wave of heat that hit Thomas Miller was distinct. It wasn't the smoky, frantic heat of a stove fighting a draft. It was a retained, heavy warmth. Miller stepped inside. He stripped off his gloves, bewildered. He looked at the window. The glass was intact. He looked at the ceiling. It was exactly where it was supposed to be. "My door," Miller stammered. His lips blew. "My door crushed itself. My windows exploded. The whole house came down on our heads." Jensen poured a cup of black coffee and slid it across the rough-hewn table. "Tangential shrinkage. Thomas, I tried to tell you." Jensen walked to the wall. He pointed to a small, almost invisible gap between the vertical logs. "Look here." Miller squinted. He could see that the logs had indeed shrunk. They were slightly narrower than they were in the fall. There was a 1/4-inch gap between the timbers. "The wood shrank," Jensen explained, "just like yours. But my logs are standing up. They got narrower, not shorter. My roof hasn't moved an inch. My door frame hasn't taken an ounce of weight." Jensen tapped the gap. And see that inside the gap? Miller saw the edge of the oak spline. Even though the logs had pulled apart, the floating spline was still bridging the gap, blocking the wind. The wall got wider. Jensen smiled, but it didn't open. And because the logs are vertical, gravity doesn't crush the openings. The house stands still. The ugly cabin was a masterclass in accommodating the inevitable movement of nature rather than fighting it. Let's break down the hard science of why the neighbors froze and Iron Olaf thrived. It comes down to a property of materials called anisotropy. Wood is an anisotropic material, meaning its physical properties are different depending on the direction. 1. Longitudinal shrinkage. Along the grain lengthwise, wood is incredibly stable. A 10-foot log will shrink less than 0.1% in length as it dries. That is practically zero. 2. Tangential shrinkage. Across the grain widthwise, wood is volatile. It can shrink 8% to 10%. Miller built his cabin, stacking the volatile dimension. He stacked shrinkage on top of shrinkage. 10% shrinkage by 10 feet of wall height equals 1 foot of settling. This is why traditional cabins need settling space above doors and windows, a gap left empty to allow the wall to come down. But Miller, rushing to beat the winter, hadn't left enough space. The physics of the wood crushed his home's infrastructure. Jensen built his cabin, utilizing the stable dimension. 0.1% shrinkage by 10 feet of wall height equals 0.12 inches of settling. Jensen's roof stayed exactly where he put it. His door frames saw zero load. His windows remained square. But the genius was the spline joint. In a traditional cabin, when logs shrink, the chinking mud mortar creates a rigid seal. When the wood pulls away, the seal breaks. This creates air infiltration. By February, most traditional cabins are leaky baskets. Jensen's floating spline created a dynamic seal. The spline was free-floating in the grooves. As the vertical logs shrank in width, the gaps between them grew. But the spline was wide enough to span that growing gap. The wind would hit the gap, hit the spline, and stop. Because there was no mortar to crack, the seal never failed. Additionally, Jensen benefited from capillary action. In Miller's horizontal cabin, rain and melting snow hit the curvature of the logs and pooled in the cracks between them, encouraging rot and freezing expansion. In Jensen's vertical cabin, the grain of the wood ran up and down. Water followed the path of least resistance straight down the grain to the ground. The walls shed water like a duck's back. The vertical orientation kept the timber drier, which in turn increased its R value. Wet wood loses its insulation properties. Dry wood keeps them. Miller and his family stayed with Jensen for 2 weeks while they repaired the structural damage to their home. They had to use screw jacks to physically lift the roof off the walls to reinstall the door. When spring finally broke over the Upper Peninsula, the mockery had vanished from the community. In fact, if you visit certain heritage sites in Michigan or Quebec today, you will see barns and homes built in the stockade style. They are easy to spot. They are the ones with vertical stripes. They are the ones that still have their original door frames, square and true, 100 years later. The neighbors called it ugly because it didn't look like the past. They didn't realize Jensen was building for the future. Thomas Miller eventually rebuilt his barn using Jensen's vertical method. He admitted, over a pint of ale years later, that while the horizontal cabin looked like a postcard, the vertical cabin lived like a fortress. Beauty in the frontier wasn't about symmetry or style. Beauty was a door that opened when you needed to get out, and a roof that stayed up when the snow came down. Iron Olaf Jensen proved that if you respect the grain of the wood will respect you. But if you try to fight the physics of shrinkage with nothing but tradition, the math will crush you every time.